Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be hosting this discussion where we are going to dig into the potential of crowdsourcing to help cities better meet the needs and wants of citizens by deepening and broadening public participation. We're going to explore how crowdsourced insight from citizens can help to inform better policy decisions by leaders, how community participation can help us design amazing spaces that people love, and how crowdfunding can fuel really creative grassroots ideas that might not otherwise happen. I'm also going to consider the challenges and limits of this bottom-up approach to urbanism, as well as the benefits. My name is GOURLAY. I'm the founder of Spacehive. We're a UK-based crowdfunding platform that helps communities create everything from new street markets and murals to nature reserves on derelict bits of land by tapping into funds from local people and businesses, but also municipalities. And I'm joined by two fabulous speakers. We have CORALIE WINN, who is co-founder of Gapfiller in New Zealand. Gapfiller is a social enterprise which was born in the aftermath of the terrible earthquake in Christchurch, and it collaborates with communities to design and deliver, hundreds of really wonderful, very creative, very playful projects that themselves have really brought people together. So very excited to hear from her shortly. And we're also joined by CABALDON, who is long-standing mayor of West Sacramento, Hazel Kramer Endowed Chair, professor of public policy, and administration at Sacramento State University. And during his time as mayor, Christopher experimented with crowdsourcing and participation techniques as a way of making it easier for citizens to contribute to city decisions on their own terms, developed a lot of insight into the benefits and also the challenges posed by using tools and approaches that involve communities more directly. So thank you both for being here. A general question to both of you, if I may, just to kind of kick things off. When we talk about crowdsourcing urbanism, I think there's a common thread that focuses on looking to try and harness ideas, it could be insights, resources directly from citizens, basically to create better, more democratic cities. But as you know, within this sort of conceptual umbrella, there's a whole mix of different approaches, things like there are platforms like Spacehive that help communities to start and collaboratively fund projects that improve the civic environment. You've got tools that allow policymakers to harness insights from citizens and approaches to designing and building stuff that work hard to involve communities, like Gapfiller. Could each of you just start by sharing your own experience of using crowdsourcing or community participation in your work? What is the significance and value of this as an approach from your perspective? Christopher, when you go first.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. And this is, the power and the potential of crowdsourcing has been long recognized, but and a lot of cities and communities have been experimenting, and mine certainly has one of them. I think at the beginning, kind of like when Facebook and Twitter first came out, we're like, oh, democracy itself is going to be democratized, and we're finally going to hear from real people and all that, and we realized that there's some good and bad with some of the platforms, and they haven't achieved everything that they intended to do. And I think we're learning some of the same lessons from crowdsourcing. So when we first started, it was how do we raise more voices up? How do we hear more? How do we get more people talking? And I think what we've discovered is that making sense of the public, and not just hearing, but making sense of what the public is and saying isn't as straightforward or as stable as we might have thought. That there is a role that institutions and others play in that process that is important. And making sense is, in some sense, itself a social function, not something that we can just do like in the mayor's office or as an individual citizen. And then finally, and this goes to the outstanding work that both of your organizations have been doing, is that the engagement is two-way. That citizens are changed by the city. They're changed by places. And you can't simply ask what's in your head, but also how are you going to experience a different kind of future and a different kind of reality. So we've been trying to think about how to hear more, but also hear smarter, and also to listen to things that people are saying and talking about and feeling and thinking even when we're not asking them. So we were one of the first cities in the world, along with Paris and Tel Aviv, to use a platform called Zen City, to use AI essentially to spider through social media, public social media posts that folks are putting out in our community on Twitter or Facebook. So they're talking about it. We didn't ask, but it's a way for us to sense better what's on their minds. What are their real fears? What do they say when they're not at a public hearing? And it's been a very useful tool for us to be able to understand, but also to hear voices that aren't as loud, to hear voices that aren't as sharp and as stark and sometimes as mean, but to hear other kinds of communities and places in the city. And I guess one of the other example I'd share is that we're working with a lot of other design firms, engineers, and others around how to use augmented reality in order to give citizens the tools by which to better imagine alternate futures. Not simply say, hey, what do you think about self-driving cars? Or what would you think about if there was a thing called Uber? Or would you ever ride a micromobility scooter or not? People always tell us, no, I would never do any of those things. But in part, it's because they don't have the language, they don't have the visualizations to understand that. And so giving citizens tools, not just asking them more, but also giving them the tools to imagine better, I think is one of the really interesting and important evolutions in the crowdsourcing for democracy movement that's occurred in the last couple of years, including in cities like mine.
It's a really interesting angle, that, isn't it? How do you, if you're going to throw open the net, cast the net more widely, get views in from more diverse sources, how can we make sure that people can reach the same sort of qualities of judgment and decision-making, informed decision-making as city leaders do? And things like augmented reality are a really interesting tool that potentially help with that. Coralie, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, Morena from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Yeah, I think it's super interesting, that idea of the public, because there's not just one public, and that's something that we've experienced a lot in Christchurch after the earthquakes. This idea of consultation for the public, and sometimes we need to zone in on more narrowly on those publics. We began after a natural disaster, so the context was very different back then. It's 11 years since that now. But what we learned, I guess, when you've got a city that's basically been laid bare, there's a lot of energy out there from people who want to contribute to shifting it, to helping it recover, to making it something different. And at that time, I guess there feels like there's a lot of potential because the situation is so bad. And as that shifts and as the city becomes more finished, maybe people find it less easy to see how they might be able to affect change in the city. So I guess our work has been all along trying to give people the chance to be active citizens and participate in shaping their city. And the communities that we work with might be sometimes geographical, but they also might be communities of interest, or like a certain cycling club or a gardening group of people or whatever, but motivated by some kind of interest as opposed to geography. But we've found that what we're really trying to do is similar to what you were saying, Christopher, is proposing projects or interventions or events in the city which might give people the chance to experience the city in a completely new way. And that then opens their eyes to other possibilities of what they want from their city. And it's, like what you're saying, you give people a fancy render on a piece of paper of some public space with, really slick-looking people in it. But if you actually propose a project in public space and let them experience it and have interactions, and it leaves a kind of indelible mark on them, that then allows them to just open their mind to what might be possible, especially in the context of climate change and the rising inequality that's coming from that. Yeah.
And did you find, you've done a lot of projects over the last few years, do you find that they sort of buzz off each other in a way, that people see one and that leads to ideas about what can be done next?
Yeah, and absolutely. And one of the things with Gapfula in the early days and still now is we weren't trying to have a monopoly on empty spaces or walls or whatever, where you could do empty buildings where projects could happen. It was more like, hey, everybody, look what happens when all sorts of people are given support to realise their ideas in the city. Look what it does for people's sense of agency and stake in the city. And look what it does for how the city then feels about itself. So absolutely, the projects bounce off of one another, but then they inspire other people in another area to do their own thing. And that's where the real power is. It's not just about what we can do. Yeah.
Christopher, from the perspective of city leaders, where does crowdsourcing sit, would you say, in the sort of toolbox more generally? So what I'm getting at, in what circumstances can it be a really powerful tool that adds value? But also, what's your sense of where it's not useful? What are the limits of this as an approach? Where do challenges start to arise?
Yeah, I think the fundamental limitation and kind of boundary that you got to draw in order to be effective, both for the city but also for the public, is that it's not a replacement for democracy. It's not a sort of an ongoing polling. Like, we're not just interested in hearing what your preformed fixed opinion is. We actually have devices for that already that in large measure are good enough. But it's really about discovering and learning from each other and growing from each other in a way that we can't otherwise. And so I think one of the things I love about both of what's happening with both of your organizations is that it's giving cities a way to engage with citizens that is not opinions about city actions necessarily. It's not just what should the zoning be or how high should this apartment be, but instead, in the installations in Christchurch, here is something we just created. React with it. Iterate with it, replicate it, copy, riff off of it. So you don't go out and do a poll first and say, what would you like? Instead, you're out there, or you're creating a platform for other citizens to say, I have an idea, and you let folks interact with those ideas. So instead of that, it's not mainly about choice making. It's not mainly about decision making, which I think was the early version 1.0 of crowdsourcing, was how do we make decisions more democratic through these kinds of platforms? I don't think it doesn't work that way. Instead, it's about hearing and seeing other views about the future, about ourselves in that way. So, part of our challenge in decision making is this future self problem, that we cannot imagine what change might look like, or how much we might actually like it or want to shape in a different way. And installations and projects that are on Space Hub or whatever do that for people in a way that I can't do that as a mayor, because people take it as a proposal. And it's going to be a law. It's going to be $10 million or whatever. But this allows for a much more nimble, flexible, agile way for a community to reimagine itself in that sense, in a way that allows you to pay attention, as Coralie said, to distinct communities inside the city, and not just what does 50% plus one of the entire population want to see happen. It's about seeing the passions and the energy that's out there. So I could convene a public meeting and say, do people want to see more bicycling or not? Or I could do what Coralie's kind of pointing to. I could look to see how many people are signing up for the bicycle club. How many people just signed up to do the bicycle race on Saturday? I should be able to see that. And so part of looking at crowdsourcing is not just the asking, but it's also seeing the signals through the noise of what your citizens are already saying. And I think mayors are looking for ways out of the traditional, let me propose something, have a public participation process where everybody says, no, I don't want any change at all, except I want the entire city to change, but I don't want any of these specific changes. That's incredibly frustrating for a mayor who runs and wants to change and transform and help their city along. Crowdsourcing is providing new ways for that divide between government and citizens to really co-create communities in a much more useful way.
It's interesting that you say that, because something I experienced in the UK, where we've worked with municipalities to introduce the crowdfunding of the civic environment. That point that you made really resonates, because sometimes people are familiar with tools that force quite an abstract conversation about how a place could be, where people naturally coalesce towards the nice stuff and balk at the nasty stuff in terms of the vision for the future. And it's a little bit difficult for an administration to know quite what to do with that, because it's not particularly constructive, not particularly helpful sometimes. Whereas if you focus on a particular project, which through collaboration with the community and the municipality you can bring to life, in a sense, it's another way of having a conversation between citizens and the state and leadership about what the future could look like, but in the context of delivering something very specific.
You know, Chris, it's such a key point, because what we know from the cognitive research about public participation is that when citizens are in a good mood in the public participation process, they are more likely to be inclusive in their thinking. They're more likely to be imaginative. They're more likely to care about their neighbor. They're less likely to bring a set of negative prejudices to the table. And most of our government processes don't really produce joy. Whereas the installations that Coralie presents, or looking at an idea that a neighbor, you know, a crazy neighbor of mine put on Space Hive or whatever, these are ways in which they change the way that the brain is processing public participation around in a positive frame that radically alters the relationship between a citizen and the future of their town.
One of the things we've observed in Aotearoa is, and it's happening around the world, is like our local governments are starting to use tactical urbanism a lot more. They're a little bit scared of it initially, but they're really starting to see the benefits. If they work with someone like us to like put in a temporary change to a street that makes it more pedestrian friendly and slows the traffic down and has a cycle lane, and they do that pretty quickly and very lightly, yeah, sure, they're going to get people that hate it. And they're going to get, you know, people giving feedback, and they're going to get people that love it. But at least then they're getting real-time sort of data, which they can use to implement the long-term process, rather than like running this lengthy consultation, which I'm sure you do, Christopher, and it doesn't go anywhere, and you waste a lot of time and money, and it's very frustrating.
Coralie, can you give us just a little bit of background to kind of where the inspiration came from for this as an approach? You know, what did the world look like before you started doing this stuff, and how has there been a bit of a shift perhaps in just public perceptions towards the way in which you approach the public realm, and I guess from the municipality too? And it'd be really great if you can give us an example of a project that you love, that you think really captures this sort of more participatory approach.
I think before the earthquakes that we had that kind of kick-started gap filler, there wasn't really a sense of pressure that you could affect a lot of change. I think, you know, like any city, things are set in their ways or set in their views of it to some extent, and things happen within it. But after the earthquake, literally the city was, you know, laid bare, and so there were lots of opportunities for people to reimagine or revision what could be possible, and that's when we began. And we really wanted to, I guess, make use of what we saw was an opportunity to test ideas, to see what people wanted their city to be like by actually experiencing it. So people were contacting us when we started with lots of ideas, and we had our own ideas, and we were just making things happen and inspiring other people to do things and showing the way, I guess. Because it was quite common. People would say to us, "Oh, how did they let you do this?" And I think the they meant was Christchurch City Council. And it's like, oh, well, they're helping actually, and it's good. And people were astonished because they'd internalized the bureaucracy or the red tape culture. They think that nothing is possible, which is really sad, but not really surprising. So one of the things I think that was really impactful about what we did was show how you can do things. And especially in the post-quake years when our legislation was actually different, it did allow for a lot more to happen actually. But as that sort of dropped away over time, we're like 11 years from the earthquake that caused this to kickstart, things have gone back to more heading towards the status quo, and we're trying to really keep some of that momentum. I mean, it has definitely shifted what people think is possible in Christchurch, and what is possible for people to participate. And it's changed the energy of the city, and it's changed the way the city identifies a lot. And it's had an impact on other cities around New Zealand. We do work around the country and sometimes overseas. We used to via Zoom. And where we are sort of sharing what we've learned, and we're seeing things like our National Transport Agency, Te Waka Kotahi, actually like fund tactical urbanism projects to allow communities to rail like a traffic calming in a particular street and putting in a cycle lane and actually getting real-time feedback from people. Yeah, we love it. Yeah, we hate it. But then feeding that into the long-term planning and long-term development of students. And I guess an example project that you'll it's a really perfect example is our dance project, which is an outdoor dance floor with speakers and lights and a mirror ball. And there's a washing machine that we got in that, and you basically hook up your phone and you get music and music and lighting in half an hour. And it brings this city to the area, and it becomes whatever you want it to be depending on who's using it. And it gives amazing social interactions which you wouldn't get otherwise. Like I've had wild time dancing with kids and older people and also just because it brings in that. But the most interesting thing about it, I think, is that there was a trial of would people dancing. Because when we did the project, lots of people who I thought highly of were like, no, Christchurch people won't use this. It's not going to work. And I was floored by that. I don't know. And I was really nervous. And anyway, fast forward, it's been used so much and people love it. And what it's done is sort of test on a small scale with relatively little risk. The idea that yes, people will dance in public, even if they're not drunk. And if a city is looking at factoring in an urban dance place in a development, you can look to this project trial of that with confidence rather than doing lots of detailed cost estimate analysis or whatever, or it's going to cost $300,000, $400,000, and then they're probably not going to do it or whatever. So the Dancer Mat is a wonderful example. Test something at a small scale, impact on the fabric of the city. Yeah, and it's just who doesn't love dancing?
Fun. Listen, a last question just to close things out for both of you. We have had a global pandemic. We are emerging from it, hopefully. And during this time, it's obviously changed the way that people live and work in cities dramatically. And I think a lot of people, a lot of communities around the world have felt a deeper sense of connection to the local area. They've been looking anew at what they want from their local area. And I just wondered what your thoughts were about to what extent this big event might start to shift the way that we think about cities and the way that we make communities in the future. What are the challenges and opportunities? Christopher, do you want to go?
Yeah, the pandemic's effects, I think, also reveal that just sort of throwing opinions around, whether it's around vaccinations or closing parks or whatever, like we were all generating new opinions every single day and throwing them at each other and posting them or whatever. But we also realized, staying home in many countries, we realized how important that park down the street was. Or we looked at an art installation down 3 blocks away in a way we never had before. We saw people across the street and it made us happy to see them. And we weren't thinking about crowding. We were instead thinking about that human connection. So in some ways, I think it helped to reconnect us with place in a very local way in our communities, but also to understand that that opinion wasn't the main way that we engage with each other. And that cities aren't mainly policies. Cities are mainly passions and experiments and a little bit of change here and a little bit of iteration there. They're aspiration. They also create pain points that we have to overcome, but they are all these things at once. They're an energy, a set, and a collection of ideas as much as they are some decision-making process. And I think there is an appreciation both of the, maybe we don't know everything about every topic. I don't have an opinion about every public policy matter, but I do have, and I want to participate and engage in my city in a different way. And I think as a mayor, I also recognize that that's what citizens wanted. They wanted to connect with something bigger. And when you look at a place like Paris with its 15-minute city notion, or Barcelona and the super blocks, these are how the kind of work that Gap Builder is doing, or the kind of projects that show up on Space Hive as part of the Mayor of London partnership. This is how it rolls up at scale, right? It's not just about that it's producing really great hyper local neighborhoods, but it's also showing communities how that can translate to redesign and re-engineering, reimagination of the city as a whole in ways that have profound social and climate and other implications. And so I think that this strand of work in crowdsourcing for democracy is really critical to rebuilding that sense of trust. The one other thing I'd say is that it's more likely now that people in Christchurch will imagine themselves running for city council, running for mayor. I know in the US, we have a massive problem. Because of all the vitriol of social media and everything else, a lot of people are saying government is not for me. Women in particular, LGBTQ citizens, but many others. I can't deal with all the hate and all the nastiness. And so thinking about how to redesign the engagement between citizens and government isn't just about getting better ideas. It's also about opening up government and helping a broader range of citizens actually take the reins of those decisions themselves too.
Awesome. And Coralie, what's your sense of how the pandemic has perhaps shifted attitudes or people's sense of what's possible, what they want from communities, what they want from cities?
Yeah, just tautaku, or I really respect what you were just saying then, Christopher, about local democracy and about the impacts of the pandemic. And I think we in this country, we've thus far been really, in some ways, quite sheltered from a lot of the impacts of the pandemic. It's shifting now for us, but I think one of the things has been obviously connection to place, like what you said, Christopher, but the connection to public spaces, and especially in bigger cities where parks, they took on a whole new residence in the pandemic when people were in lockdown and they not able to go and do the things that they wanted to do. And I think the lack of public life, the bumping spaces that we have in bumping to people in our communities, when you take that away, you see it in quite stark terms around what it does for our communities. So I know here, having much quieter streets where we could ride with our kids or scooter with our kids or walk down the street and see people at a distance and say hello. And the streets, the neighborhood streets actually were busier than what they would have been normally because everyone was hungry. So it really shows in some ways the way that the pace of modern life and all the expectations of living in a 24/7 culture is actually not good for our health. And more and more people are wanting some slowness and some what you're saying, this local connection to place, bring it back. And I think it's having an impact on how our cities invest in our local areas and how they value that sort of that connection to place, because it's so important in terms of people's mental health and well-being.
Well, listen, thank you both so much. We touched in the last half an hour on some of the sort of social and cultural and financial benefits of crowdsourcing, but also looked at the challenges and limits of this as an approach. And it's been really interesting also to think about that handshake, if you like, between this community-led activity and the intelligence and the resource that can come out of this as a model, and what the city leaders can do, and how some of those ideas can be lifted up to larger scale. Thank you both very much for joining us, and thank you all for coming in. Bye-bye.